Welcome back. Well, the timing of the attacks on Gaza is highly significant. It comes just a month before Israel holds parliamentary elections. The Israeli public has a low opinion about how their government has tackled Hamas-controlled Gaza. The opposition leader, Benjamin Netanyahu, has been leading opinion polls, but that gap has narrowed since the weekend's attacks. Meanwhile, the two main Palestinian factions, Hamas and Fatah, remain deeply divided. Gazans may have been looking towards Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas to condemn Israel's attacks, but he blamed Hamas for allowing the situation to arise in the first place. Well, still, we're joined by our guests in Jerusalem, Mark Regev, in Amman, Azam Tamimi, and in Manchester, Chris Davies. Mark Regev in Jerusalem, I mean, at some stage, you're going to have to talk to Hamas, and you're going to have to talk peace with the Palestinians from both sides of the political divide, Hamas and Fatah, no matter how unpalatable that may be.
Israel is willing to talk to Hamas if Hamas meets the benchmarks not laid down by Israel, but laid down by the United Nations. It was the former Secretary General, Kofi Annan, who articulated, I believe, 2 years ago. He said, for Hamas to be recognized by the international community, it must recognize my country's right to exist. It must renounce terrorism and violence. And it must support the peace process. And it's not just Israel that doesn't talk to Hamas. Europe refuses to speak to Hamas. Canada, Japan, Australia, the United States, most of the world refuses to deal with Hamas because of their extremism. Now, if Hamas wants to change, if Hamas wants to reform, then the door is, of course, open to dialogue, not just with Israel, but with the world. I think the problem is, as your guest in Jordan said, the problem is that in the eyes of Hamas, Israel is not legitimate. In other words, we should be destroyed, or as Mr. Ahmadinejad in Iran says, we should be thrown into the sea and liquidated. They're against peace. They're against reconciliation. They're against a two-state solution. It's not surprising. I mean, in that situation, there's very little. How can you involve them in a political process when they're against that very process?
Azam Tamimi, in Amman, I mean, the Israeli daily newspaper Haaretz carried out a survey a few months ago that said 64% of Israelis favoured a negotiated settlement, a negotiated truce with Hamas. Is this message to Israelis, politicians, that they need to find another way than just the military solution of perhaps bombing Hamas back to the Stone Ages?
Of course, the Israelis had the option of entering into a long-term truce, and the offer of long-term truce was offered to the Israelis as early as 1994 by the late Sheikh Ahmad Yassin. But the Israeli laughed off the offer. They already had a partner they thought they could make peace with until they got rid of Yasser Arafat and replaced them with Mahmoud Abbas. There is no way forward unless Israel realizes that the true representatives of the Palestinians do not agree to recognize that the occupation of their land was legitimate. And therefore, the only way is to disengage. And disengagement can be done via a truce. Why don't the Israelis release our prisoners, remove their settlers, and return to the borders of the 4th of June 1967? And then we can have a long-term truce. Israelis don't want this because they think with the power they have, with the support they get from the Americans and their allies, and with the collaboration they get from the puppet regimes in the Arab world, that they can get away with the crime they are perpetrating today in Gaza.
OK, so Chris Davies there in Manchester, you're hearing some heated emotions on both sides of the argument here. But I mean, how do you make peace if you don't want to talk to your enemies? I mean, whatever the West and Israel thinks, Hamas won elections fair and square. So should Israel engage with the democratically elected leaders of Hamas?
Israel should, the United States should, and the European Union should. And we had a brief opportunity 2 years ago when the Palestinian Unity Government was formed with Ismail Haniyeh as its Prime Minister. None of these bodies agreed to talk with that organisation. It collapsed, of course, with violence between Fatah and Hamas in Gaza just a few months later. But all the time, you know, we put the question at Hamas. Hamas must do this. Hamas must do that. Palestinians must do this or must do that. But Israel must do some things too. Every single country in the world, bar Israel, says stop your programme of building settlements, lift the blockade of Gaza. And what happens? The blockade continues and the settlements continue to grow by up to 5% in this year alone, despite international condemnation. I mean, Israel, the question has to be put to Israel as well as to Hamas. What are you doing to promote a peace process?
Well, let's put that question straight to Mark Regev there in Israel. What are you doing, Mark Regev, to push and promote that peace process?
I'd say very simply by talking about the situation in Gaza. It was just 3-4 years ago Israel pulled out of the Gaza Strip. We pulled back behind the recognized international frontier, the 67 borders. We took down all of the settlements inside the Gaza Strip. This was a full and complete withdrawal. And what did we get in return? What was the response to this Israeli pulling back, ending the occupation in Gaza, ending military rule, redeploying to the international frontier? Our response has been a Hamas takeover and missiles coming into Israel. What sort of inducement does that give Israel to be more flexible further down the line?
Azam Tamimi,
let's be frankly here.
Okay, Azam Tamimi in Amman. I mean, let's just talk about the Palestinians for a second here, because, I mean, could this violence have been averted, perhaps, if there was a united Arab front in dealing with a united Palestinian front? I mean, half the problem, that there's a deadly divide amongst the Palestinians between Hamas and Fatah.
Well, that is true, but who created that divide? You see, we had a great opportunity when the Mecca agreement was signed between Fatah and Hamas, or between the Palestinian Authority and Hamas. But that Mecca agreement was not recognized by the Americans, by the Europeans, or even by the Israelis. Not only that, it was conspired against, and General Dayton was dispatched to Gaza to arm Mohammed Dahlan and his gangsters in order to bring down the Hamas regime. And this is what led to the military takeover by Hamas in June 2007. You see, we had a great opportunity that the world could work with a united Palestinian position, but they didn't want to do this. So the solution to the problem now is to go to the Mecca agreement, form a national unity government, reform the Palestinian security institutions, and then if Mahmoud Abbas wants to continue to negotiate with the Israelis, he can bloody continue to do that if he wants to, and let him get the Palestinians something. But the world doesn't want this to happen, and they continue to create divisions among the Palestinians by creating collaborators and puppets, by supplying them with millions of dollars.
Okay, Chris Davies, let's just bring you back into the discussion here and just widen it out a little bit. Because, I mean, does this escalation in violence between Hamas and Israel scuttle any hopes that the incoming Obama administration has of pushing the peace process forward? I mean, Obama's now got the situation in Gaza, he's got Afghanistan, he's got Iraq. What happens now? What does he do?
Well, it should be quite the opposite. It should concentrate the attention of the American administration, because they should recognise that unless they deal with the problem of the Middle East, of Israel and Palestine, then this canker will continue to generate hatred directed against the West for decades to come. Now, just yesterday, the Israelis killed, within 5 minutes, as many people as the Hamas shells have killed in the past 5 years. You know, this sort of one-sided approach cannot continue. The big powers, the United States and the European Union, have got to start playing and recognising that the game is completely one-sided, that Israel holds all the cards, and that's just not a defensible position. The Palestinians have got to be given more respect. The Palestinians and the siege of the Palestinian economy has got to be lifted. And the constant injustices against Palestinians have got to come to an end. The two sides have got to come to the table as equals, not with one party always able to pull all the strings.
OK, Mark Regev, let me get a final thought from you. I mean, some analysts are already saying that Israel has failed to achieve its objectives. You haven't stopped the rockets. You haven't got back Gilad Shalit. You haven't broken the resolve of the Palestinian people under occupation. So, in a way, Israel's proving to be the best recruiting agent for Hamas in some respects. Where do you go from here?
I know that we're facing challenges, but I'm more optimistic about the future. I think Hamas doesn't offer the Palestinian people real solutions. Hamas has an extremist, nihilistic agenda, like when other Islamist extremist groups, whether it's been the Taliban in Afghanistan or in Iran, they really haven't found answers for job creation, political development, and so forth. They can only be against. Israel wants to live in peace with the Palestinians. We have to move forward in a peace process. We have to have historic reconciliation. We have to see two states, Israel and Palestine, living side by side in peace. The people of Gaza deserve better than the current Taliban-type regime, which is terrible for them as much as it's terrible for us. And if you think about it, Hamas isn't just holding hostage the Israeli public in the south, those Israeli citizens who are on the receiving ends of those Hamas rockets. It's holding hostage its own Palestinian population, who deserve better. It deserves a regime that will want peace and find solutions and not have this nihilistic, negative agenda.
OK, gentlemen, we have to leave it there. Mark Regev in Jerusalem, Chris Davies in Manchester, and Azam Tamimi in Amman. Thank you all very much indeed. And thank you so much for joining us here.